A Sprint in the Life of a Product Owner by Jeff Watts. The product owner is a really important role in an agile team. They're the owner of the product or the service that we're looking to create in order to fill a need in the problem space we're operating in. The product owner will represent the customer or the customers, the users and many other stakeholders in order to clarify the strategic vision for the product and what, at a tactical level, is important to us while we're iteratively delivering value to the market. They have a responsibility to define this vision, this big picture, this goal, so we all know why we're spending money and prioritising the work to hopefully either deliver maximum value as early as possible or reduce risk as quickly as possible. Once they've clarified the vision, they'll then collaborate with a self-managing cross-functional team to turn those ideas about what we need into working functionality, all the while updating, influencing and just generally managing all sorts of internal and external stakeholders. It's a tough role, but it's an important and incredibly rewarding leadership role, and when it's done well, it relies a lot less on authority and control than a lot of people assume to begin with. The best product owners that I've seen and worked with are all driven. And this acronym stands for decisive with incomplete information, because we'll never know everything, but we still need to make progress. Ruthless in their drive for value within the product, because many tough calls around prioritization and stakeholder conflicts will be needed. Informed about stakeholder needs and the feedback that they're providing about the development of the product. Versatile in the leadership style they adopt at different times. Empowering of the self-organizing cross-functional development team, and negotiable in what the solution looks like and how it gets implemented. But what does a typical sprint look like for a product owner? Well, it's a difficult one to answer because every sprint is likely to be very different, but there are a few things that a product owner can expect to see and do in any typical sprint. The first one is day one, because that's when sprint planning happens. It doesn't necessarily take all day, but it will always be on day one. And the product owner will be doing three really important things in sprint planning. Firstly, they'll be explaining the goal of the sprint and tying that into the vision. Now, a goal and a vision are really important because Agile is based on empiricism and the principle that we can't know everything up front, and that there are always going to be unknown unknowns. So instead, we form goals that we know are valuable, but we leave how we're going to solve the goals to emerge through collaboration and inspection and adaptation with that self-managing team. The second thing a product owner will be doing in sprint planning is explaining the priorities within the product backlog. The product backlog is the list of things that we know we need to do, and it will always be in order of importance. And the third really important thing that the product owner will be doing in sprint planning is clarifying and negotiating what done means for the items the team are considering pulling into the sprint. How will we know this is complete? What are the conditions of success for the work items? After sprint planning, we've got the rest of the sprint. And the product owner doesn't just hand over a set of requirements for the team to work on during the sprint and leave them to it. They'll be splitting their time in three different ways. The first will be collaborating with the development team on the work being done. So giving some feedback, doing some testing, elaborating the ideas we had in sprint planning, and guiding the emergence of the solution. The second way they'll be spending their time during the sprint is collaborating with customers. So getting feedback on previously delivered work. What do they like? What don't they like? What does that mean they can do now? And what might they want in the future? The product owner will also be looking ahead at what the next 6 weeks might look like, so they can constantly restock the product backlog with what we know to be important now, and to let people know in advance if we might need help from them in an upcoming sprint. And the third way that the product owner will be spending their time during the sprint is collaborating with users on their needs and their priorities, running experiments to test hypotheses, observing users to see how the product's actually being used. Basically, running continual market research and gathering data. Now, all of those things will result in refining the product backlog for the next sprint. Because agile is an empirical approach based on test and learn, the product backlog is never complete and needs constant refinement based on the feedback on the work that we're doing. But what does refinement actually involve? Well, 3 things. Firstly, adjusting product backlog items. Adding items that weren't there because we weren't aware of them before, removing old ones that perhaps have been completed or aren't any longer needed, maybe adding extra detail to them because we've uncovered more context, and perhaps even grouping items up or splitting them down into smaller pieces of work. In short, adjusting our product backlog so it better reflects the reality that we know now. The second aspect of refinement is adjusting priorities. So certain things could become more or less important over the course of a sprint, and these changes should be reflected. And the third aspect of refining the product backlog is perhaps adjusting the definition of done, either because we're expanding our scope of doneness, or we've got a greater understanding or clarity of what done actually means for us now. So those are 3 things that we need to do in order to refine our product backlog. But how do we do them? Well, you guessed it, there are 3 ways. So the first is what I call quiet time. As a product owner, finding a little bit of peace and quiet and then getting stuff out of my head and updating either the physical or the virtual cards or tickets on our product backlog. The second way we can do this is through ad hoc conversations. Now, it doesn't have to be just the product owner, but through any conversations that are happening about the product backlog items, we need to capture that new information that we're uncovering. Or our third option is to have focused collaborative workshops. So you might call them refinement workshops or user story workshops, and they usually take place 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the sprint for an hour or 2 with a cross-section of people, developers, stakeholders, subject matter experts, where we discuss and analyse the upcoming product backlog items to clarify them ahead of the next sprint planning session. Then, finally, at the end of the sprint, we've got a big ceremony called a sprint review, where we get to see, test, get and give feedback on what we've managed to get done this sprint. And the product owner will be responsible for 3 things in the sprint review. The first thing is accepting or rejecting anything that hasn't already been accepted to go live. Quite often, we'll have been doing that as we've been collaborating with the development team during the sprint, but some things will run up to the last minute, and we then present it to the stakeholders, and they'll say, "Yeah, that's great, deploy it." The second thing a product owner might be doing at a sprint review is updating the stakeholders on any changes or pivots to the plan that we had beforehand based on the feedback from the sprint review or what's happened during the sprint's delivery. Perhaps the team managed to get through a lot more work than we thought, which means we can bring dates forward or get more functionalities sooner. Or perhaps more scope's been added, which means the date needs to be pushed back based on the delivery capacity of the development team. And the third thing that a product owner is responsible for in a sprint review is deciding whether or not to fund another sprint. So, based on our ability to deliver so far and how the product backlog has evolved, that may cause me to stop funding the product and shift our focus to something else. So, in summary, the product owner will be working with the development team on the work in progress. They'll be doing some preparation for the next sprint and making strategic plans for the evolution of the product based on feedback and data from customers and users. And that is a sprint in the life of a product owner. As I said, it's a tough but very important and rewarding leadership role.